Princess Valith Sorn had spent her entire life studying the species known as humans, but she had never seen one in person until today. Her people, the Kilori, stood 8 feet tall, with scales that shimmered like liquid metal and claws that could tear through starship hulls. And they had ruled their section of the galaxy for 10,000 years, without ever encountering a species they truly feared. But the archives told a different story about humans. Every file about them carried the same warning, stamped in bright crimson letters that read "Prohibited Contact," and referenced something called Galactic Accord 7412. And no matter how many times Valith had requested access to the full records, her requests had been denied. Now she stood in the obsidian halls of Neutral Station, wearing ceremonial robes that felt too heavy on her shoulders, preparing to marry a creature from that forbidden world. War between her people and the Veteran Dominion had consumed 60 years and billions of lives, and entire star systems had been reduced to radioactive wastelands where nothing would grow for millennia. And still neither side could claim victory when the architects, those ancient beings of light who had existed since before recorded history, had offered to broker peace. The Kilori High Council had accepted without hesitation, but the terms of that peace had shocked everyone. The architects demanded a union between the warring powers and a neutral third party, someone bound to neither the Kilori nor the Veteran, someone whose species had been sealed away from galactic affairs for 3,000 years. They demanded a human V-less father. High Sovereign Naldoy Sorn had laughed when he first heard the proposal, asking what possible use a primitive creature from a quarantine world could serve in matters of galactic importance. The architects had not laughed. They had made clear in terms that allowed no argument that this was the only path to peace, and that a human had already been selected and extracted from Earth and prepared for the role he would play. So here Valith stood, watching the chamber doors slide open to reveal her future husband. Commander James Reus walked into the room with a confidence that seemed entirely inappropriate. For his situation, he was smaller than she had expected, barely 6 feet tall compared to her 8, and his body showed none of the natural weapons that most intelligent species possessed. No claws or fangs or armored plates or venomous spines. His skin looked soft and fragile, the kind that would tear under the slightest pressure, and his eyes were a simple brown color that would be nearly useless in low-light conditions. Everything about him screamed weakness and vulnerability, yet he walked toward her without any trace of fear in his expression. And when he stopped before her, he met her gaze directly without looking away. "Princess Valith," he said in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber, "I understand that neither of us chose this situation, but I want you to know that I intend to honor whatever agreement will keep your people from destroying each other." She studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but his face remained open and unguarded. "You speak as though you have some personal stake in our survival." Commander Reyes, something flickered across his features, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. And then he smiled in a way that did not quite reach his eyes. "Let us just say that I have a professional interest in ending wars." The ceremony itself was brief and utilitarian, conducted by an architect observer whose form shifted between geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, and witnessed by representatives from both the Kilori, Hegemony, and the Veteran Dominion. Valith spoke the words of binding in her native tongue while James repeated them in his own language. And when it was done, they were husband and wife according to the laws of 3 different civilizations. The Veteran representatives watched through compound eyes that revealed nothing of their thoughts, their insectoid bodies clicking and shifting with barely contained hostility. And Valith knew they viewed this entire proceeding as a humiliation forced upon them by powers they could not resist. Her own people seemed equally uncomfortable with the arrangement. Though they hid it better behind masks of diplomatic courtesy, only the architects appeared satisfied with the outcome. Their geometric forms pulsing with colors that might have indicated approval or might have meant nothing at all after the ceremony. Velith found herself alone with her new husband in the quarters. They would share for the duration of their posting on neutral station. James stood by the viewport, looking out at the stars with an expression she could not read. "You have questions," he said without turning around. "Many questions. Ask them." She moved to stand beside him, keeping enough distance to maintain propriety, while close enough to observe his reactions. "Why did the architects choose you specifically when there are billions of humans on your world?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "They did not tell me, and I did not ask. Because I learned a long time ago that some questions do not have answers you want to hear." That is not a satisfying response. No, I suppose it is not. He finally turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like exhaustion, as though he carried a weight she could not see. "What I can tell you is that I was a soldier on Earth, a commander of men in conflicts that seemed important at the time, but probably were not. And when the architects appeared and offered me a chance to do something that actually mattered, I accepted. You agreed to marry a stranger from an alien species and spend the rest of your life mediating a conflict you know nothing about. I agreed to try to stop a war." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry more meaning than the simple movement suggested. "Everything else is just details." Velith did not know what to make of this strange creature who spoke of ending wars as though it were a simple task that anyone could accomplish with enough determination. She did not know why the most ancient powers in the galaxy had deemed his species too dangerous to interact with other civilizations. She did not know what secrets lurked behind the crimson warning stamps in the archives. But as she watched James Reyes return his gaze to the stars with that same unreadable expression on his fragile face, she felt a small spark of something she had not experienced in 60 years of war. She felt curious, and she intended to find answers to every question that burned in her mind, no matter what it took or what truths she might uncover, because something told her that the real reason humans were prohibited from the galactic community was far more significant than anyone had led her to believe, and she was determined to discover what it was. 3 months into her political marriage, Velith had compiled a detailed list of everything strange about her human husband. The list grew longer every day. Humans required an absurd amount of sleep, nearly 8 hours out of every 24. Which meant they spent a third of their lives unconscious and vulnerable to predators. Their bodies maintained a constant internal temperature, regardless of the environment around them, burning through calories at an astonishing rate, like engines that refused to shut down even when idle. They consumed an almost random assortment of organic matter for nutrition, including compounds like capsaicin and alcohol that would poison or kill most other species in the galaxy. These were strange traits, certainly, but they could be explained as quirks of evolution on an unusual world. What could not be easily explained were the other observations Velith had made. James Reyes did not react to danger the way any rational creature should. The first incident occurred during a diplomatic reception meant to celebrate the Sci-Fi 1-month anniversary of the peace negotiations. Representatives from both the Kalori and Vethran delegations had gathered in the Grand Hall of Neutral Station, and for a few hours it almost seemed like the two sides might learn to tolerate each other. Then the assassin struck the Vethran creature, burst from a ventilation shaft with impossible speed, 8 legs carrying it across the ceiling as its venomous blade swept toward the assembled dignitaries below. It was a suicide attack, designed to restart the war by killing high-value targets from both sides and making it look like each had betrayed the other. The Kalori guards froze. their threat response systems overwhelmed by the speed and unexpectedness of the assault. The veteran representatives scattered in panic, their exoskeletons clicking against the floor as they sought cover, and James Reyes moved toward the danger, not away from it, not into cover, not toward an exit, toward the assassin. Velith watched in disbelief as her small, fragile, weaponless husband placed himself between the attacker and a young, veteran child who had been brought to the reception by one of the diplomats. The assassin's blade caught James across the forearm, slicing deep into flesh and muscle and scraping against bone. And blood began pouring from the wound in a steady stream. Any Kilori would have collapsed from the pain alone, their nervous system shutting down to prevent further damage. James kept fighting. He caught the assassin's next strike with his injured arm, ignoring the blade that cut even deeper, and used his other hand to grab the creature's thorax and twist. The crack of breaking exoskeleton echoed through the silent hall. The assassin fell, and James stood over it for a moment, blood dripping from his torn arm onto the polished floor. Before turning to check on the veteran child he had protected, "Are you hurt?" he asked the young creature in a calm voice, as though he had not just sustained wounds that should have left him screaming in agony. The child clicked a negative response, too shocked to speak properly. "Good." James nodded once, then sat down on the floor with careful, controlled movements. "I am going to need medical assistance now." He lost consciousness 30 seconds later, but only after confirming that everyone else was safe. The medical team that treated him expressed amazement that he had remained functional for as long as he did. Given the severity of his injuries and the amount of blood he had lost, Velith sought answers from the architect observer assigned to monitor their union. How did he do that? She demanded, pacing the small chamber where the geometric being had agreed to meet her. His pain receptors should have incapacitated him immediately, and his blood loss alone should have caused him to lose consciousness within seconds of sustaining those wounds. The architect's form pulsed with soft light as it considered her question. "You have identified one of the reasons why humans were classified as a prohibited species." "Princess Velith, what do you mean?" "Humans do not experience pain the way other species do." The architect's voice resonated directly in her mind, bypassing her ears entirely. For most intelligent beings in the galaxy, pain serves as a command that overrides all other functions, forcing the organism to stop whatever it is doing and address the source of the pain immediately. Velith nodded. Because this was basic biology that any child would understand. For humans, pain is merely information. The architect continued. They process it, analyze it, compartmentalize it, and then choose how to respond based on their priorities rather than being controlled by the sensation itself. That should not be possible, and yet you witnessed it with your own eyes. The architect's form shifted into a new configuration. Humans evolved as persistence predators on their homeworld, a strategy unique among intelligent species, and they developed the ability to continue pursuing prey across vast distances for days at a time, ignoring hunger and thirst and exhaustion and pain until their target collapsed from the relentless pursuit. They hunted by refusing to stop. Precisely. The architect pulsed brighter for a moment. They do not know when to quit, princess. And this trait has become embedded in their very biology, in the structure of their minds, in the core of their identity as a species. Velith absorbed this information in silence. "You said this was one of the reasons they were prohibited." She finally said, "What are the other reasons?" "That information requires a higher level of authorization than you currently possess. I am married to one of them." "Yes." The architect's tone carried something that might have been amusement. "And that marriage was arranged specifically to give you legitimate reason to seek that authorization. When you were ready to receive it." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means, princess, that you should continue your observations and continue asking questions." the architect began to fade from visible light. When you have learned enough to understand the full truth, the archives will open for you. It vanished, leaving Valeth alone with more questions than answers. She walked to the medical bay where James was recovering from his injuries and stood at the observation window. Watching her husband sleep, his arm was already healing, the torn flesh knitting back together at a rate that the medical staff called unprecedented for any species they had treated. His vital signs were stable and strong, showing no sign of the trauma his body had endured just hours earlier. He was impossible. She realized everything about him defied what she understood about biology and psychology and the fundamental nature of intelligent beings. And somewhere in the sealed archives of the architects, there was information that would explain why a species this impossible had been locked away from the rest of the galaxy for 3,000 years. She needed to find those archives. She needed to understand what she had married, because something told her that the truth about humanity was far more significant than anyone had let her believe. And that truth might be the key to ending not just this war, but preventing any future conflict from ever starting again. She just had to be brave enough to uncover it. It took Valeth 6 months of careful maneuvering to gain access to the sealed records. She called in every political favor she had accumulated during her years as a princess of the hegemony, leveraged her new status as a bridge between the warring powers. And when those methods proved insufficient, she resorted to something approaching blackmail against an architect, sub-administrator, who had made certain promises that his superiors would not approve of. The archive chamber was buried deep within Neutral Station, behind 17 layers of security that included biometric scans and psychic verification and temporal locks that only opened during specific alignments of stellar bodies. When Valeth finally stood before the central console and spoke her authorization codes, she felt her heart pounding with a bound mixture of fear and anticipation. The files that appeared before her were written in a language so old that it predated the current galactic standard by over 50,000 years. She had to use 3 different translation matrices just to make the characters readable. And even then, some of the concepts did not have equivalent terms in any modern tongue. But what she found changed everything she thought she understood about the galaxy and her place in it. Humans had not always been quarantined on Earth 3,000 years ago. They had been a spacefaring species with colonies spread across a dozen star systems. Their technology was crude compared to the elder races, their ships slow and inefficient, their weapons primitive by galactic standards, but they had spread across space with a speed that alarmed the powers who had watched civilizations rise and fall for millions of years. Then the humans encountered the harvesters. The records described them as a machine civilization of unimaginable age, self-replicating constructs that had existed since before organic life had evolved on most worlds. They consumed organic species to fuel their expansion, stripping entire planets of biological material to convert into new machine components over 1 million years. The harvesters had destroyed more than 40 intelligent species across the galaxy. No one had ever stopped them. The elder races had simply learned to stay out of their path, to hide when the harvester fleets passed through, to accept that some forces of nature could not be resisted. The humans had not hidden. The humans had fought. Valeth read the records with growing disbelief as the scope of the conflict became clear. The war between humanity and the harvesters lasted for 200 years. In the first decade, the harvesters bombarded Earth with enough firepower to render the planet temporarily uninhabitable, forcing the survivors to scatter across their colony worlds with no home to return to. 90% of the human population died in that first wave of attacks. Any other species would have surrendered, would have accepted extinction as inevitable, and simply waited for the... And the humans did not surrender. They retreated to their surviving colonies and regrouped, analyzing every piece of harvester technology they could capture, studying every weapon and every tactic that had been used against them. They lost every major battle for the first 50 years. But they learned something from each defeat. They adapted by the 100th year of the war. Humans had reverse-engineered harvester technology, well enough to build weapons that could actually damage the machine ships by the 150th year. They had developed devices that could destabilize the quantum foundations of harvester consciousness itself, turning the machine's own complexity against them. They created biological weapons that corroded synthetic materials, viruses that could infect machine networks and corrupt their programming. And when none of that was enough, they did something that the records described with a combination of horror and awe. They began using themselves as weapons. Human soldiers volunteered to be implanted with explosive devices powerful enough to destroy harvester core ships. They called these missions one-way tickets because the casualty rate was 100%. And yet the volunteer rate never dropped below what was needed. They flew their primitive vessels directly into the heart of harvester formations, bypassing the machine's defensive calculations because no rational species would waste resources on attacks that could not succeed. But the humans were not concerned with rational calculation. They were concerned with winning. The harvesters had never encountered anything like humanity before for 1,000,000 years. The machines had operated on a simple formula of overwhelming force and calculated efficiency. And every organic species they had faced eventually made the rational choice to surrender or flee. Humans made no rational choices. They kept coming regardless of losses, regardless of suffering, regardless of any calculation. That said, they should give up. The records showed that harvester strategic systems began experiencing what could only be described as confusion in the final decades of the war. They had no protocols for dealing with an enemy that treated extinction as business motivation rather than deterrent, and so the harvesters were destroyed, not defeated, not driven back, not contained, annihilated. The humans chased the last harvester ships to the very edge of the galaxy, burning through fuel reserves and life support to ensure that not a single machine survived. They found the harvester homeworld and reduced it to atoms. They scoured every system where harvester influence had ever been detected and cleansed it with nuclear fire for the first time in 1,000,000 years. The galaxy was free of the harvester threat, and then the humans turned around and looked at the elder races who had watched the entire war without lifting a finger to help. The records contained a single transmission, broadcast on all frequencies, in every language known to galactic civilization. Who is next? The architects quarantined humanity the following year. They did not do this as punishment for any crime, because the humans had committed no crime by defending themselves against extinction. They did it as containment. Humans were returned to their restored homeworld, their spacefaring technology confiscated, their memories of the war and the wider galaxy carefully adjusted so that they would forget what they had been and what they had done. The elder races sealed the archives and classified humanity as a prohibited species, not because humans were evil or aggressive or dangerous in any ordinary sense, but because when humans committed to a goal, they did not stop until that goal was achieved. Whatever the cost, whatever the suffering, however long it took, and a species like that, let loose among the stars, would eventually change everything. Valith closed the archive with trembling hands. She understood now why the architects had chosen a human to broker peace between her people, and the veteran Thea had not chosen James Reyes because humans were peaceful or wise or diplomatic. They had chosen him because when a human decided to end a conflict, That conflict ended one way or another. She needed to find her husband immediately. Valith found James on the observation deck, standing alone before the vast viewport that showed the endless field of stars beyond Neutral Station. He did not turn when she entered, but something in the set of his shoulders told her that he knew she was there. "You accessed the archives," he said quietly. "And it was not a question. You knew what was in them. I remember now." He finally turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not noticed before. A weight that seemed to press down on him from within. An exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. When the architects extracted me from Earth, they gave me back what was taken from my ancestors. The memory of what we were and what we did and what we are capable of becoming. Valith moved closer, studying his face with new understanding. "Why did you not tell me any of this? What would I have said?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Hello, wife. My species committed complete destruction of another civilization to survive, and the entire galaxy is right to be afraid of us. The harvesters were monsters that consumed entire species." "Yes, they were." James nodded slowly. "And we did not just defeat them, Valith. We erased them from existence. We hunted them to the last machine and made sure nothing remained. And then we looked at everyone who had watched us do it and asked who wanted to be next." He walked to the viewport and placed one hand against the transparent surface. "The architects did not choose me to be a diplomat," he continued. "They did not pick me from billions of humans, because I am particularly skilled at negotiation or compromise." "Then why did they choose you?" "Because they needed someone who would end this war by any means necessary." He met her gaze directly. "Someone from a species that does not understand the concept of acceptable losses. Someone whose ancestors proved that they would sacrifice everything to achieve victory." Valith absorbed this information in silence for several long moments. "And will you end this war by any means necessary?" James was quiet for a while before answering. "When I was a soldier on Earth, I commanded a unit in a war one barely understood. A conflict driven by politics and resources and reasons that changed with every new cycle." His voice grew distant with memory. "I watched good people die for causes that did not matter. And I swore that if I ever had the power to stop a real war, a war where the outcome actually mattered, I would do whatever it took. But I am not my ancestors. Valith," he shook his head firmly, "I will not burn your galaxy to save it. And there has to be another way to end this without more death. The veteran will never agree to true peace," Valith said, giving voice to the fear that had haunted the negotiations for months. "They view any compromise as weakness, and their culture demands that conflicts end in total victory or total defeat. Then we do not offer them compromise." Something shifted in his expression as he spoke. Something cold and focused and utterly inhuman despite coming from such a fragile-looking face. "We offer them a choice." "What kind of choice?" "Peace on reasonable terms. Or the alternative." He smiled, and the expression did not reach his eyes at all. "The alternative being me telling them exactly what happens when humans decide that a war needs to end. Every detail, every record, every image of what my ancestors did to the harvesters and what they threatened to do to everyone else." Valith stared at him. "You would use your own people's history as a weapon. I would use the truth." James replied, "My species is a warning label, Valith. A do not open sign on a door that the galaxy locked 3,000 years ago because they were afraid of what was behind it." He began to pace, his movements taking on an energy that had not been there before. "The veteran can have peace. Real peace, with terms that let both sides walk away with their honor intact. Or they can have me explain to them in vivid detail what is behind that door and let them decide. If they really want to find out, whether the prohibition on humans was justified. That is not diplomacy. No. He stopped pacing and faced her directly. It is leverage. And it is the only leverage that matters, because the veteran do not respect weakness and they do not respect compromise. But they might respect the same thing that made the elder races lock my species away for 3 millennia. Valeth considered his words carefully. Every instinct she had developed during 60 years of war told her that this approach was dangerous and unpredictable and could backfire in catastrophic ways. But another part of her, the part that had watched billions of her people die in a conflict that served no purpose, felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Hope. The architects knew, she said slowly as understanding dawned. They knew you would remember your history, and they knew you would use it as a threat against anyone who refused to make peace. Probably, they chose you specifically because you are willing to do what they cannot. The architects are neutral, James agreed. They cannot take sides, and they cannot threaten anyone, but they can place a human in the middle of a conflict and let that human do what humans do, which is refuse to stop until the job is done. He reached out and took her hand, and his grip was surprisingly warm for such a small creature. But I want you to understand something, Valeth. And I need you to believe me when I say it. What? I do not want to use my people's history as a weapon. His voice carried a weight of genuine emotion. I do not want anyone to be afraid of humans. And I do not want the galaxy to remember us as the species that ended the harvesters through sheer terrifying persistence. What do you want? I want this war to end because both sides choose to end it. He squeezed her hand gently. I want peace because peace is better than war. And I want your people and the veteran to realize that they have been killing each other for 60 years over disputes that could have been solved with words. And if they will not listen to words, James smiled again. And this time there was something almost sad in the expression. Then I will remind them why words are better than the alternative. And I will hope that they are smart enough to choose wisely. Valeth looked at her human husband. This small and fragile and impossible creature who carried the weight of his species' terrible history on his shoulders while still hoping for a peaceful solution. And she made a decision. I will help. You, she said. Whatever you need, whatever support I can provide. I will stand beside you when you face the veteran, and I will make sure my people support whatever outcome we achieve. You understand that this could fail. I understand. She nodded firmly. But I also understand that doing nothing has already failed for 60 years. And that trying something new is better than accepting eternal war. James pulled her into an embrace that was awkward because of their difference in height, but felt genuine in a way that surprised her. Thank you, he said quietly against her shoulder, and Valeth realized, perhaps for the first time since this political marriage had begun, that she did not regret being bound to this strange and wonderful and terrifying species. Not anymore. The delegation arrived at Neutral Station 6 weeks after Valeth and James finalized their plan. Representatives from every major power had come to witness what the architects had announced as the final peace summit. The last chance for the Kailori hegemony and the Veteran Dominion to end their 60-year war before the neutral power stopped intervening entirely. The Great Hall filled with dignitaries and officials and military commanders from both sides, each group watching the other with barely concealed hostility while maintaining the thin pretense of diplomatic courtesy. And in the center of it all stood James Reyes, a single human, unarmed and unarmored, looking exactly as small and fragile and unremarkable as the day Valeth had first seen him. The veteran war queen clicked her mandibles in contempt as she studied him from across the chamber. This is your great mediator, she hissed, her compound eyes glittering with disdain. This soft and short-lived creature is supposed to bring peace to powers that have waged war since before his species discovered fire. "I am not here to bring peace or Queen," James replied in a calm and steady voice. "I am here to offer you a choice." What choice could a prohibited creature possibly offer to the Dominion? The choice between peace and the alternative. James gestured toward the hollow projectors that lined the chamber walls. "With the permission of the architects, I am going to share some history with this delegation. Records that have been sealed for 3,000 years." The War Queen made a dismissive clicking sound. "We have no interest in ancient history. You will be interested in this." The projectors activated, and the first images appeared. They showed human ships, primitive and crude by galactic standards, engaging massive harvester dreadnoughts in the darkness between stars. The War Queen watched with amusement as the human vessels were destroyed by the dozens, their weapons barely scratching the machine hulls, their tactics utterly inadequate against the harvester armada. "Your ancestors were defeated," she observed. "This is supposed to impress us. Keep watching." The timeline advanced, and the War Queen's amusement began to fade. She watched the humans retreat and regroup and adapt, learning from every defeat, analyzing every weapon used against them, developing new technologies and new tactics with desperate speed. She watched them lose 90% of their population and keep fighting. She watched them lose their homeworld and keep fighting. She watched them lose every major battle for 50 years and keep fighting, and then she watched the tide begin to turn. Images showed human ships equipped with weapons that tore through harvester armor like it was paper, biological weapons that corroded machine systems from the inside, devices that disrupted the quantum foundations of artificial consciousness. She watched humans volunteer to become living missiles, flying their vessels directly into harvester command ships in attacks that killed the pilots instantly, but destroyed targets that conventional weapons could not scratch. The casualty rate was 100%. The volunteer rate never dropped. The chamber had gone completely silent. The harvesters had existed for over 1,000,000 years. James said quietly as the images continued to play. They had destroyed more than 40 intelligent species, and every elder power in the galaxy had accepted them as an unstoppable force of nature. The projectors showed the final phase of the war, human fleets pursuing the last harvester ships to the edge of the galaxy, human weapons reducing the harvester homeworld to atoms, human soldiers standing in the wreckage of the last machine civilization, surrounded by the remains of an enemy that had seemed invincible just decades before. "My ancestors did not accept that the harvesters were unstoppable," James continued. "They decided that the machines needed to be destroyed. And then they did not stop until every last one was gone." The final image appeared on the projectors, a single human ship, battered and scarred and barely functional, broadcasting a message on every frequency. War Queen did not need translation to understand the meaning. "Who is next?" James stepped forward, meeting her compound eyes directly. "The architects sealed my species away after that war because they understood something about humanity that no other species truly grasps. And I am going to share that understanding with you now." He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "Humans do not calculate acceptable losses, and we do not weigh costs against benefits when we have committed to a goal. And we do not know how to give up. Every species reaches a point where continuing to fight becomes irrational," he continued. "A point where the smart choice is to surrender or retreat or accept defeat. But humans do not recognize that point, and we will keep coming no matter how much it costs us, because the concept of giving up simply does not exist in our minds." The War Queen's mandibles had stopped clicking. "You have a war that has lasted 60 years. James said. "You have lost a few billion lives and some planets and systems that matter to you, and you are tired. And you want this to end, but you cannot be seen as weak. So I am offering you a way out. Accept the peace terms. With full cessation of hostilities and territorial boundaries reset to pre-war lines. And both sides agree to binding arbitration for future disputes. And if you do this, then humans remain a historical curiosity, a sealed file in the Architect archives. And if we refuse, the War Queen demanded, then the archives open completely. And every species in the galaxy learns exactly why humans were prohibited. And then you get to find out whether 3,000 years of peace made us soft or whether it just gave us time to rest. Before the next war, the War Queen stared at him for a long moment. You would threaten us with your own people's history. I am not threatening you. James replied, I am explaining the choice you face. Because you can have peace with a species that helps you save face and end this war with honor. Or you can have conflict with a species that does not stop until conflicts are finished. One human against the entire Dominion. One human was enough to start the fire that burned the harvesters to ash. James shrugged, and I am not alone anymore. He gestured toward Valeth, who stood with the Kalori delegation. And she stepped forward to stand beside her husband. The hegemony supports this proposal, she announced in a clear voice. And we recognize that Commander Ray speaks with our full authority. The War Queen looked between the human and the Kalori princess. Her compound eyes unreadable. You have married a creature from a prohibited species, she observed, and now you stand beside him against your own enemies. I stand beside him for peace, Valeth corrected. And so should you. Because this war has gone on long enough, and there is nothing left to win that is worth more lives. The chamber remained silent as the War Queen conferred with her advisors in rapid clicks and hisses. Finally, she turned back to face James. You are a strange creature. Human, and your species must be completely insane. Probably, James agreed pleasantly, but we are also very good at ending wars. One way or another, the War Queen made a sound that might have been laughter. The Dominion accepts your terms, she announced. Not because we fear you, human, but because you are correct that this war has continued past the point of purpose. And your presence gives us a convenient excuse to end it without appearing weak. Something released in Velith's chest that she had not even realized she was holding 60 years of. More billions of lives lost, and it was over because one human had stood in a room and reminded the galaxy what his species was capable of achieving when they refused to give up later. Alone in their quarters, Valeth found James sitting with his head in his hands. You did it, she said softly. I bluffed, he replied without looking up. I do not know if any of it would have worked. I do not know if I could have actually followed through on the threat. Because the truth is that I just wanted the killing to stop. That is not a weakness, is it not? He finally raised his head. I just used my people's worst moments as a weapon to prevent a war. And I'm not sure whether that makes me a hero or a monster. Valeth sat beside him and took his hand. The architects chose well, she said. Did they? They chose someone who would do whatever was necessary to end the war, but who would also hope for peace until the very last moment. She squeezed his hand gently. They chose someone human. James was quiet for a while. Before speaking again, what happens now? Now we build something better. Valeth replied, now we prove that the galaxy was wrong to fear your species. And we show them that humans can be partners instead of threats. Outside the viewport, the stars burned cold and eternal across the infinite darkness, somewhere on a small blue world called Earth. Billions of humans lived their lives without any memory of what their ancestors had accomplished or why the galaxy had locked them away, but the powers that watched from the shadows remembered now. The veteran remembered the Kalori. Remembered every species that had witnessed the broadcast of human history. Remembered, and they would never forget why some Doors should remain closed unless absolutely necessary, but perhaps, Violet thought as she held her husband's hand and watched the stars together. Perhaps some doors were worth opening after all, perhaps. Humans were exactly what the galaxy needed, not as a threat to be feared, but as a reminder that some species refuse to accept the impossible end. That made all the difference.